Old lady waits for son's release from prison. Unwanted guests broke into her home and were horrified. I can't wait for my son's release from prison. I know I'll see him soon, but these unwanted guests broke into my house and were horrified. What happened? Tune in to find out. When an old bus takes off, it envelopes Steve in a rushing cloud of exhaust gas and leaves him standing at an unsightly little stop. The man looked around and started walking toward the house a mile away. Steve hasn't been there for 8 long years, and now he's not even trying to hide his happiness. Admire the straight rows of pines growing on both sides of the road. Steve didn't stay home for too long. As he was serving a sentence for theft in the county jail after being released, he decided to leave his criminal past behind and return to his hometown. The closer Steve got to the house, the faster he walked. Hastily hugged her mother but deliberately did not tell her the exact date of release with the intention of surprising the old woman. Finally, the painfully familiar house and manicured green lawn appeared when he knocked on the door. Steve heard the old woman's footsteps and a gentle cough responded. A minute later, Mrs. Anderson opened the door and, not knowing if she could trust her eyes, put on her glasses to get a better view of the visitor. "Steve, you're finally back. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? I'm going to cook you your favorite casserole dish," said the old woman, hugging her son who lost weight during the years of captivity. After taking Steve to his room, the old woman began to disturb the kitchen and wanted to give her son a delicious treat. The man showered and changed clothes he thought would remind him of his time in prison. Sit at the table munching on a delicious omelet. Steve tells his mother that he has committed a crime and will find work. At first, Mrs. Anderson did not take her son's words seriously. The old woman just remembers all too well how Steve said the same things every time he came home from prison. Unfortunately, things don't usually go beyond those conversations, and Steve is back soon. Criminal life. However, when Steve got up early the next day and went to look for work, the woman realized that maybe he was serious this time. Unfortunately, despite good credentials from the prison administration, no one wants to hire ex-prisoners. Tired of rejection and promises to be called back tomorrow, Steve was desperate and depressed. With great difficulty, he finally found a job at a sawmill run by his old classmate Frank Dawson. However, after a month of working in difficult and inhumane conditions, Steve learned the hard way that Frank was not a good person. He fired Steve on the pretext of the day before he was supposed to be paid. Penniless Steve comes home and locks himself in his room. He hasn't touched alcohol once since he got out of prison, but experiencing injustice like this at work has made things clear. Steve had been drinking for days until Mrs. Anderson fell in love with him and urged him to pull herself together. The woman's heart broke to see her son suffer, so she advised him to go to church on Sunday and talk to the priest. The man had never attended a ceremony before, so he doubted his mother's suggestion. However, when Sunday came, Steve put his beliefs aside and went to church. The man stood aside during the service so as not to attract his attention and not disturb other parishioners. The thing is, Steve is embarrassed to admit that he doesn't know a single prayer and doesn't want to stand out. After the service, the priest approached Steve and asked him what was bothering him and if he wanted to talk about it. The man looked at Mr. Brown hopefully and told him about his run-ins with the law and his dark past. Later, embarrassed by its candlelight, Steve adds that he does not know how to live. After listening carefully to what Steve had to say, the priest took him by the hand and led him into the backyard of the church, where there was a cemetery 100 yards away. It is never too late to turn to Steve, and if you are looking to serve people, I can offer you a job in the cemetery. Doubts were evident on his face. Then he thought about it a bit and realized that at that point he needed to work more than anything else. Steve accepted his offer to work at the cemetery from that day forward. He has many tasks so that the man does not have time to be bored. Steve restored gravestones, tended lawns, and helped gravediggers bury the dead. Mr. Brown gave Steve his old pickup truck so the man could get around town and shop faster and easier. Steve worked diligently and selflessly, achieving the respect and financial stability he had dreamed of all his life. Once a man was sitting on a bench near the old chapel during lunch hour and eating a sandwich. His mother suddenly made him try to grab another from behind. Steve was surprised to learn that it was empty. As he wondered where his lunch had gone, the man looking around stood up from the bench. He looked around the corner of the chapel and saw the little thief have fun eating delicious food. Is a small white puppy of an unknown breed. The puppy seems insensitive to any man and continues his meal. Steve gently reached out to touch the animal and couldn't help but smile at the dog wagging its small tail and growling in response. The man who dreamed of having a dog his whole life decided to bring the dog home. He realized that it might die if he left it on the street, and he couldn't let that happen. He picked up the dog, object, and put it in the front seat of his truck, and they went home. As usual, Mrs. Anderson was waiting for her son on the doorstep to give her a hug and kiss on the cheek, but today, instead of the usual ritual, she looked at the little puppy incredulously as she asked her son why welcome this poor companion. He was very weak and thin, but Steve just smiled at him and said Charlie would live with them. The man named the puppy Charlie after his childhood friend who drowned while swimming in the river. At first, the puppy and Mrs. Anderson don't trust each other to nurture their friendship only when Steve comes home from work. However, time passes and Charlie gradually wins the heart of the elderly woman, who accompanies him while she waits for her son. Charlie grew up to be a strong, handsome dog that was the envy of Mrs. Anderson's neighbors and guests. Such a defender lived in the house. One day, while Steve was at work, 2 armed thieves broke into Mrs. Anderson's house. Screaming and brandishing a gun, the big red-haired thief demanded money and valuables. The frightened old woman screamed and covered her eyes with her hands. At that moment, Charlie threw himself at the second thief holding his leg. The red-haired criminal pointed his gun, and after a while the whole neighborhood heard the gunshots. At the same time, the dog yelled and one of the thieves screamed. Meanwhile, Ms. Anderson ran down the street and started screaming for help. It turned out to be unnecessary, as neighbors flocked to Anderson's house equipped with everything from hammers to baseball bats. It was soon over, and the bandits who had been beaten were handed over to the police, who came to take the call. Ms. Anderson was in shock and needed medical attention, and after an initial examination it was decided to hospitalize Ms. To further monitor her condition, Steve was informed of the attack and rushed home. When he entered the house, all he saw was Charlie bleeding in the living room. Hugging Charlie, Steve carefully placed him in the front seat of the truck, then honking desperately, he hit the gas and rushed to the vet clinic. Charlie ran out of time when Steve brought the half-dead dog into the operating room. The vet said, "I don't even know if Charlie will survive the operation." Sitting in the waiting room, Steve cried and prayed that his dog would live. Fortunately, Charlie survived the operation safely, but the vet's prognosis remained grim. If the dog survived, he would never be able to walk, the man said, looking away. When Steve visited Ms. Anderson in the hospital, all the old woman wanted to do was go home and find out what Charlie was up to. The man responded briefly and just said the dog was fine. By being surprised by his lies, Charlie was finally released from the clinic a few days before Ms. Anderson went home. Unfortunately, the vet's prognosis was correct and the dog was almost completely paralyzed. He was able to stand up, but after taking a step or two he was exhausted, groaning and screaming miserably. Charlie seemed to understand his position too well, so he stopped eating, refused to go to the bathroom. While Mrs. Anderson returned from the hospital, the first thing the woman did was to call Charlie. Standing on the lawn with a present for the dog, Charlie came here. My boy Steve stood in silence, knowing that Charlie would never be able to come out to greet the owner locked in his mat. Window side. Suddenly the door creaked almost inaudibly and the dog appeared on the threshold, stumbling weakly. Charlie came out to greet his owner. Steve couldn't hold back his tears. He fell to his knees and cried. It is for the first time in his life he had seen such selfless loyalty.